Thanks everybody for turning up again to the second of our webinars for the Green PB Organisers project. And today with us we've got Karin Eyben from Northern Ireland. Unfortunately, we were going to have Alan Budge here today as well, but he's ill and so isn't able to join us. So it's just Karin today. So thank you for taking all of the airspace and myself. We'll run it as pretty much the format as we described before. So just to kick us off, Karin, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and your different roles and, just introduce yourself to the group?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jez, and lovely to meet everyone. So my name is Karin Eyben. I am, I suppose, like with probably everyone on this call, have a number of different hats. The main hat that has brought me into this space is I'm a member of the Hare's Corner cooperative. The Hare's Corner is an old farming term for the awkward edges of the field. And they are, in their awkwardness, it means that no machines, tractors can get to them. And in those spaces, life flourishes, including possibly the hare might build its nest. So we've used it as a metaphor for who we are as a cooperative, which is a coalition of makers, facilitators, educators, carers, who we're all committed to really learning how do we build the care of people and the rest of nature into our practice. And sometimes, as probably everyone in this room knows, to change, it feels awkward. Can sometimes, you might look awkward doing something for the first time, and it will be a little awkward. So that's our metaphor of the Hare's Corner. So our home is in the oxygen catchment of Garver Forest, which is in County Derry. It's a 200-hectare forest, and we have developed over the years this metaphor of the oxygen catchment. So a community that is shaped by that basic exchange of air between a forest and the populations around the forest. So PB has been a strand or a weave of me for the last, trying to think, Jez, when the first time you came to Northern.
16 or something?
Yeah, something like that. So around the last 10 years. So wherever I have meandered, PB has followed me. So as part of a cooperative, we have been doing some PB, but my practice as a practitioner has kind of from different places, and I still feel in the foothills in terms of my PB practice.
I think we're all learning as we go along. So what I'm going to do now is take us right back to one of the early days when I was first going to Northern Ireland. I met with Karin and other groups involved in a project called the Big Dish Out. And that was one of the first participatory grant making events in Northern Ireland. There's been quite a few since, although they've all remained quite small scale, and there's a whole back conversation about why we can't break through, but let's leave that to now. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to share my screen and I'm going to play that recording.
We're just welcoming people and we're registering them, and really we are asking them, are they bidders, are they voters?
We're inviting them in to vote for what they want to see in their community.
So when they come in, they're to sit down at one of the tables, and then after the welcome and getting people doing a little bit of getting to know each other, there's going to be 16 pitches of 2 minutes each, and then voting will be opened, and they're going to go into the canteen and place their 5 votes. They have to distribute their 5 votes. They cannot put them all in one pot. And after that, get some tea, coffee, refreshments, and then voting will close. We will count the votes, and then there'll be an announcement of who's got the money and who hasn't.
This is for our community, and to have so many people involved is absolutely fantastic.
Turn to the person on your right, shake them by the hand and say, hello, how you doing? Go.
Tonight is around not binning our voices, not binning the great ideas in Harpers Hill and Crosby. Each person will have 2 minutes.
Your time starts now.
great to see actually so many parents from the community coming out, because it means, this obviously means something to them. So hopefully down the line this will leave a wee bit of a legacy, and we can follow it on up in our own community association later on, maybe next year as well.
And it's not easy standing up here, you know. Maybe it's a bit easier for David and I, we've done this before, but people who stand up there in front of the camera, in front of their friends, you know, and it can be nerve-wracking.
It's good to say when you start putting chairs out. That's always good to say when you have to actually bring more chairs and
Might need more buttons.
Yes, we ran out of buttons. I think it's going very well. Yes, yeah. All good.
Well, I've lived here all my life. I've been, what, many years we lived here? 40 odd years now, and it's nice to be part of it. Be back to school.
It's very good. It's very good for people to have their say and to put forward their ideas.
It's good for the community.
Yeah, it's great. It's good attendance. I didn't really realise that all these people would turn up to it, but it's greatly supportive.
Everyone had 5 votes. The voting station is in there. Remember, distribute your 5 votes. Do not put your 5 votes in one pot.
Great. So many people voting.
It's just a really nice atmosphere. It's just, this is community.
We're just counting the buckets. I scrutinised. We had our observers down the voting table, and nobody cheated.
So what happens next is the guys who won will get the money to do the idea, and we're going to come back together about the end of September, early October, as a group of people, as a community, to hear how the projects went.
Feeling great. We won this. Hopefully we can start getting the men together and maybe put a wee pull team together and a darts team together and help us socialise together and keep things going and bring a community together even more.
We feel brilliant. We're delighted, aren't we?
Oh, delighted.
We're
Absolutely
delighted.
delighted.
We didn't think we'd get it. We thought there was a lot of deserving people, so we thought it was brilliant, didn't we?
Very, very glad.
And we're looking forward to starting up a wee club. Big dish out.
Great evening. Yeah. Yeah, I think it kind of ticked all the boxes that we wanted to tick in terms of people kind of realizing that how they changed their minds when they heard people, and it was really supportive and all kinds of ages, so it was great.
Enjoyable evening, definitely. The response from the crowd's great. You get the feedback. From my point of view, you get feedback from the crowd. You feed off it. You know what I mean? And if they're enjoying themselves, I enjoy myself. Making them enjoy yourself, if you get any sense out of that.
Fantastic success. Just thrilled. They're quite moving. Yeah. Lumps in the throat at some points and all, you know. And on to the next one.
Really enjoyed the evening. It was great fun. So it was. It's great getting everybody together.
It's just such a buzz in the place, you know, and everybody's come out very excited.
Big dish out.
Thank you. So I showed that video because I think it gave a really good overview of what took place on a distribution day, on an event. Obviously, there's a lot more around setting that up, getting the bids in, then afterwards working with people who have been successful, commiserating and supporting the people who haven't. So just Karin, can you tell us a little bit about how the big dish out came about, and maybe about how that's led to other things that you've been doing?
Really, the bigger context was local government reform in Northern Ireland. So that's when we moved from 26 councils to the 11. And we had developed a project called the Waste No Time project, which was really looking at the opportunities of our new council area, and at that time the real hope around citizen-centered and community planning and deliberative spaces. So there was a lot of hope and vision as part of that reform. And our Waste No Time project was kind of saying, let's waste no time in making sure those foundations are right, or as right as we could make them. So the Big Dish Out came out of that project. So we worked in 2 areas. One was in Harpers Hill that you've just seen the video, and then in Cushendall, which is in the Glens. So broadly speaking, a majority Protestant Unionist area, and the other one was a majority nationalist area, nationalist Catholic area. So the Harpers Hill one, I do think it was the first time I was involved in PB in a real sense. So you might have picked up a lot of the possibly nervousness from some of the organizers and partners, because we were on a very high adrenaline. So the process was working with the Cross Glebe Community Association, which would be the main group in that estate. And there was a lot of time helping them and helping ourselves understand. We were learning as we were making the road or building the road, understand what PB was. And so that took a few months, and we really invested time in that. We then invested time in building relationships with the council and other partners. So in that film, you would have seen the partners of the Big Dish Out, which was a kind of creative arts company, was a organization working with learning disabilities. We had the council there. We had a housing association, Radius Housing Association. So we really tried to build understanding of PB with the services and the organizations that were also working alongside that community. I'm trying to remember why we called it the Big Dish Out.
I could help there, actually.
Please.
There was a similar project in
right.
the South Coast, a youth project that was called the Big Dish Out. And in the way of all good things, you thought that's a nice idea. And then once you got the Big Dish Out, then the whole chef thing sort of emerged.
I know one of the reflections from our local community partner afterwards was, it was probably, we went too far ahead in that metaphor, because initially people thought this was a cooking project to do with recipes. So anyway, that's when you can be too creative. I think, so there was a number of learnings from that. I think one of the key learnings from the Big Dish Out in Harpers Hill was that one of the bids that had come in, and that was part of the nervousness that night, one of the bids that had been put forward was for the purchase of bonfire pallets for the bonfire, and to be burnt on the 11th night, 11th of July, as part of a big kind of a Northern Irish celebration. And this caused a massive issue within the organizing and with the local council. Because it was proposed to have the bonfire. Bonfires are very regulated, and there's controversy. They're very controversial. So one of the bids was to buy resources for quite a controversial event. And so there was a lot of negotiations about whether to let the bid go or whether to pull it. And either way was going to cause wider political ramifications. So the bid went through with some caveats in terms of the normal, is it safe, is it legal? The legal was a grey area, and is it feasible within the budget? And a really interesting thing that night is that voters didn't vote for that bid. And instead they voted for other things. And one of the feedbacks that came through is, when you're faced with voting for equipment, for example, from the early years group, and voting for pallets that will be burnt in one night, the decision was about investing in longer term resources. So that was really interesting, but that was really putting our faith in the wisdom of the decision-making process, and the wisdom of seeing all the options in terms of investment in that community and not voting for that one.
If I can come in there, I think that's really critical. Obviously, in Northern Ireland, that whole separation between the Protestant and the Catholic community, and that's led to a whole lot of sort of control from the centre, from the government. They're really worried about anything that might damage that delicate sort of sense of trust that's built up there. But one of the later reflections I heard at one of our conferences around PB in Northern Ireland post-COVID is that the communities that had been doing PB prior to COVID were actually in a better position to kind of respond, that it had started to build links both across communities but also within communities, so that people were able to then kind of negotiate better how to respond to a common need that everybody was facing. So there's lots of those little kind of learnings that happen on the side of PB. Anyway, tell us a little bit about what you've been doing since, and then we'll get on.
So I suppose some of the recent PBs. So most of my PB experience has been within the Causeway Coast and Glens Council area. And they have, in the main, been citizen-led and citizen-driven. As Jez said at the beginning, there has been no real statutory council support. PBs have been small-scale, grant-led, and often monies that have been raised by the communities themselves in terms of the pot. So we have kind of kept alive the PB practice and experience and benefits from a community perspective, but as we call it, it's PB 1.0, Generation 1.0. So I've been involved in a number of PBs in the Glens, in the Causeway Coast and Glens. One of the PBs in Gava, in terms of our cooperative, was a PB process over COVID called Commoning Possibilities. And afterwards, we used the donut economics model to really frame the bids, the winning bids that had come through. So that was our first time of really starting to hold in one hand the interdependence between well-being of people and well-being of the rest of the natural world, and how do we start thinking a much more interdependent way around these issues. So since then, we have been using the kind of the donut as a way of just holding those conversations and holding that space. We've just finished in Gava, so one of our first PBs in the area was with our 6 primary schools. This was about 7-8 years ago, which was all done in the forest. And we've kind of built on those relationships developed by the schools, and we've just finished a PB just in the summer there, where again, the children were considering what are the ideas that they could give back to their local place, in terms of whether it was the school site or the forest. So we're developing that more and more, thinking about that interdependence of people and rest of nature and how we can kind of do PB.
Great, and you've helped a number of PB projects get going, introduced it to a new audience or a new community. What would be the sort of the key message that you want them to take on board at the beginning of a PB grant making or PB process of any sort?
Key message that it is fun. It is it's really good fun to be involved in it. And if it isn't fun, then probably shouldn't be doing PB. It needs to be starting from that point of, yeah, we're going to have a good time here. There is, I think, for a first time, that there is a lot of investment. And this has been one of a lot of people's time is needed. And there's this constant balance between knowing that PB needs that investment in relationship building, in holding the space for understanding, because this is one of these things. PB can either seem incredibly obvious, and at the same time, it's incredibly radical. It's completely overturning how we think about how money is decided upon and distributed. And that takes time to explore that mindset shift and that practice. So I think it's holding that balance and in And I've only been involved really, other than in GAVA, in first time PBs, and that's been our frustration, that we've had a first go at this, but there's never been then the resources to do a second or third or fourth time. Because as you grow the practice, then that initial investment of time obviously decreases. But I think the other thing is that you discover so much more about your community than you realized. You discover individuals that have never turned up at a community meeting. You hear about work and projects and hopes and things that people have done that again have been invisible. So that making visible the incredibly richness of people and work in a community. That's what PB does as well.
Yeah, I think we have that phrase, the money is the bait, not the fish. And the fish really is all of those relationships and all of that learning that goes on around this process, and all that, also that sense of agency. I know that's a bit of a buzzword, but that sense that we can do that here that is able to be generated. So is there any other reasons how you can reduce the amount of work? You've been at the center of these things. What have you learned about how to kind of spread out that workload, or you know, or why is all that work worth it in your view?
I'll start with the second one. Why the workload is worth it. There are obviously things you can do to become a little bit more efficient, and I can talk to that, but fundamentally the workload is important for that first foundations of the first time in a community. An example that always stays with me was in our PB and GAVA, where we used the donut economics model for the first time. And it was a 9-year-old girl. So in GAVA, we have a forest, as you know, and in the middle of the forest is a pyramid. And the pyramid sits on top of a mound. And she had noticed that her granddad wasn't able to climb the mound to see the pyramid anymore. So her bid was to put in for £50 to do a little bit of research around something that could be put in place to help her granddad and then other folk with mobility issues climb up to the pyramid, because it's an iconic place in the area. So she then, through existing relationships, she met up with a council officer. And there's a lovely photo of the council officer crouching down in the forest and listening to her idea. She put in the idea and she got enough votes for it to happen. And so then the council came up behind her and put in a wooden handrail that goes from the bottom all the way up to the pyramid. Now, when you look at that wooden handrail now, if people don't know the story, it just looks like a simple handrail. Behind that story is a young person who had the courage to notice and have agency around that and put in an idea. A council who came in alongside and didn't take over, and a partnership there that allowed the council to bring in their own resources to make that happen. This would have never happened in a normal grant process. This young person wouldn't have been eligible as a 9-year-old to put in for a grant as an individual. And none of those relational issues that happen would have happened through a normal grant process. So that reminds me all the time about that invisible work of investing in the relationships and investing and taking that time to make these things happen.
And I'd like to follow that up with another little story, which is similar, which is actually from the USA, where in Arizona they've been doing a school-based PB for a number of years, and that basically is pupils within secondary schools produce ideas, they advocate for those ideas, and then there's a vote. And I can show at another time a nice video about that. But one of the ideas that came through was just putting up sunscreen shades in the playgrounds. And as you can imagine, Arizona is pretty hot. And that bid won. But at that event, so that school got some extra sunshades to go in the playgrounds to make a kind of relaxed place for young people to meet. at that meeting, there was also the head of education for the whole of the Arizona state, who then picked up that idea, and that has now been rolled out across all of the secondary schools in Arizona. So an idea, a seed that was planted in a PB event, has sort of multiplied and spread, and that idea of how it can change the conversation to be community led rather than officer or council led is one of the things that always turns me onto it as well. Where can it go wrong, Karin, though?
Oh, in so many places. Um, so I suppose some low points for me in my PB kind of journey. One, I think, was we undertook a PB that we had the celebration event just a couple of months ago in Kobe. So that was the biggest PB pot that I've been involved in. We had a pot of 50,000, which was then in partnership with a housing association, Regis Housing Association. And it was a brilliant voting event, the normal, celebration. But the way the votes came through is that a number of the bids that were for groups working with minoritized communities didn't win, didn't come through. And I know kind of Jez, Lisa and I kind of chatted to you about kind of weighted, are there ways of kind of looking at this? But that was a real, I suppose, gunk for us and also obviously for the group, because there seemed to be a pattern there in terms of the pattern of particular groups not coming through. So there's lots of design features that you can build into this, and I know we've talked about that, but that was a low point. I think another really interesting one was one of the areas that we worked with is a very small rural area, village. And it was really challenging because there were very thick relationships between people that go from generations. And people were really resistant to any other way of decision making than the one that existed around how resources are allocated. And that was incredibly challenging in that small place. And so there's something about scale of geography, which I think is really interesting one. And there's different challenges around PB depending on the scale of geography. Another one which kind of showed the proof of concept in a sense, so this is more of a positive story, was in another village called Hare in County Derry. And the votes came in and the bids came through, and about, let's say there was about 5 or 6 bids that didn't quite get enough money to kind of come through. And a local company came in behind and funded all the ones that didn't get enough votes. So basically all the bids got the money. On the one hand, that could be a really good news story because actually no one had to lose out. But it kind of totally undermined what the purpose of PB was, which is around the wise decision making of people. And really, really interesting. The bids that shouldn't have got through because they weren't voted on and then got the money didn't work. They didn't. It never happened. Those projects didn't happen. So I think that was a really interesting about proof of concept about why this is it's respecting the wisdom of local community. So yeah, so I don't know if that's answered your question, Jez, but
I think that is. I think this has been a really rich conversation. There's been loads in there, and I think it's probably about time to sort of bring in everybody else to the conversation if that's possible. And I suppose I've got a kind of a challenge or a question. Maybe you can answer it first, Karin, but anybody else can chip in, which is about this is all about shifting power in some way. It's whether that's power that's already embedded in the community or power that's within the local authority or power over resources. But when we're facing a kind of climate crisis and time is short, what can everyday citizens do if government isn't going to fix this? How does PB fit into that idea of citizens taking action themselves? And I'd really be interested in people's reflections on that. based on what you've heard. But of course, any questions you've got for Karin to sort of unpick some of the richness. So I'm just going to throw it open to anybody who wants to chip in. I realise, Claire, you're not on screen, so please do raise your hand or just speak up because you're on camera, on audio only. So anybody want to kick off, respond to that, respond to what you've heard, ask a question for Karin? Kenny.
Yeah, I totally loved the story with the pallets. Being from central Scotland, we took absolutely weeks to decide on the colours for our Pullman Community Hub logo. We had to get the right balance between green and white and red and get some blue in there as well, you know. Otherwise, if you're too much green, you're on one side, too much blue and red, you're on the other. So to hear that the pallets never got funded, I was like, wow. But then again, you can see that it's a case of, should we burn effigies to celebrate war, or should we buy something for the kids' primary school? I think any rationally minded person knows where a rational vote should go. But it's a great story.
I think just for richness, and Karin, maybe I'm coming. Sorry, I really enjoyed that. One issue was being at the verification panel, that meeting before the actual decision day, when the council officers and the police and everybody was trying to get this through. And one of the ways that the pallet committee, the bonfire committee, had sold this was, well, if you don't fund the pallets, we'll burn tyres instead, and that will be worse for the environment, which I thought was really interesting. But at the end of the day, somebody said, you know, that everyone felt this wasn't really within the scope of this project. This wasn't what it was about, to celebrate one particular community. Claire, you wanted to come in. You're from Northern Ireland, so you may have something interesting to say on this as well.
Yeah, no, just more, I guess, the thing that really shines in those stories is the trust, I guess, in the process, and that, I guess, that's what PB is all about, is kind of, you know, putting that trust onto the people and letting them make those decisions. And it was lovely, Karen, hearing that story, because there was trust there, you know, for people to make the right decision. And sometimes that's all you need, you know, there's just that kind of, there's that lack of trust sometimes, and it's lovely to hear stories when it works like that. So yeah, it was lovely to hear that one.
Great. Any reflections, Karin, and then anyone else?
I think one of the really important is that particular bid was within the context of so many other bids. I think if the community had just been deciding on that particular bid and nothing else, then it might have been a different decision. But for me, because it was next to all these other bids, then it gave real choice and real thinking through. So there is something for me about just trusting communities with the whole picture. This is the pot of money. These are all the different options, and broadening that space for options. So it's about expanding the space, I think, was really important, because in that particular bid was in an expanded space of possibilities, and that led, I think, to decision making.
Anyone else? Phil.
Yeah, I'm interested in who came and what reflections did they have. I'm wary that this, you know, these spaces are quite difficult, I think, for people to come into, because, like you said, trust and confidence and skills and all the things that go to make us kind of less inclusive than we should be. So I'm interested in who had the courage to say, I'm going to be part of this, you know, and why? Because, you know, there's a lot of mistrust in these kind of processes, and I'm always intrigued of who comes and why, and what gets them over that threshold to say, yeah, I'm going to be part of this. And I'm just wondering what your reflections were on
that. Critically, it was that core anchor community group. So it was Cross-Glebe Community Association, because we didn't have the relationships in that area. They were the ones that were the trusted and credible group that had the relationship. So once they got it and were interested, then everything flowed, which is why really investing time with that group to kind of make sense of this was really important. And then we kind of then going out with the volunteers of that group to explain what PB was to all the other groups in the area. I mean, one of the you've seen in the film, we had this brilliant group called the Happy Hookers. So those were the two. So they were a group of women who were at a stage of their life where they didn't want to join the Women's Institute. They didn't want to join, groups that they felt would have the label of making them old. But they were at a transition point for various reasons in terms of bereavement and employment and so on. So I remember that one particularly, that session of explaining what PB was, because they were just so full of playfulness and energy, and they were really all well networked. They had the grandchildren in the school. They had, their children who were working in the local shop. So it was about identifying key groups once you got your anchor and bringing them on board. So it's like that snowball effect. If you can kind of identify and get people excited, and then they are able to then bring others on board as well. So I think that was a kind of a key one. I think going back to the courage it takes, that voting event is the only time that we have done the pitching. Because that takes a lot out of people. Ever since from that point, we've done the marketplace, which has allowed for, I suppose, less nervousness and terror of standing up in front of your friends and community, and also allows for more conversations to happen as people go around the marketplace. But yeah. It took a lot of courage from people, and really interesting actually, because one of the reflections afterwards, or before actually, people were saying for pitching, it's going to be the really polished, and I know Jez speaks to that, the really polished people. So there was one person who had 20 slides, and they were all amazing and came out in a suit, and I mean, fair play to him, but that was no correlation to the votes. There was one individual who had a speech impediment, and really kind of, you could see the sweat breaking out on his brow in terms of what this meant for him. So yeah, polishness doesn't equate how people make decisions, but that was a learning for me that took a lot out of people.
I mean, I think for me, I love the presentations, but maybe that's who I am. But I do think that energy that comes from the presentation model is really, really great. And so every situation you have to design yourself. And I absolutely back that whole idea of snowballing it. So, inviting the participants to invite the bidders to invite other people that they know to come along, and then we have the multiple voting, so they have to spread it, and really that's what you want, is that sense of people being connected, coming because they're connected, and leaving with stronger but slightly different connections is really what it's all about for me. Sarah, you've got your hand up. You're on mute though. So.
There you go. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So I've got a couple of things really. The first one's an observation. As somebody who really likes to sort of overthink things and complicate things, I loved your story about the girl and the handrail. And I am going to share that story with the team, because I just think that is the simplicity of it really, isn't it? Absolutely marvellous. And then my other thing is, it's a question, it might be a silly question, and it might be that I should know the answer, but what is donut economics? Please.
Not a silly question at all. So it's a model, a frame that's been developed in the last 8-9 years as a different way of thinking about economic growth. So it's been developed by an economist called Kate Rayworth. And as she says, it's not a new model. It's just a way of visualizing differently this balance around investing in human well-being. So basically the donut, imagine a donut in your head, and you have the inner ring, which is all the stuff that we need as humans to thrive. So education, income, health, poverty, and so on. And then the outer ring is all the stuff that the earth needs to be a habitable place. So that's basically soil quality, air and waters and carbon emissions and so on. And the core thing is, how do we live in ways in our communities, in our society? How do we do our economy, which makes sure that no one falls in the hole, and that we don't overshoot the outer ring. So we have found that it's a very playful concept. It goes back to, so Kate Rayworth would say that if you talk about economics, you come into a room and you talk about economics, most people will flee at top speed. But if you come into a room and talk about donuts, you might hold them for a little bit longer, particularly if you have a plate of donuts to pass around. So again, it's that starting point of a playful starting point to open up the conversation about how do we kind of think differently about where we put our investments. The other really good thing it does for us is that it starts to see the connection. None of us can do everything. You know, there's some folk that are working on food poverty. There's other folk that are working on after schools and education. There's other folk that are working on monitoring the health of rivers. And in an area, you have everyone doing those different things. The donut is a visual that starts to visualize that and connect and make those connections.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you.
Kenny, you put a question in the chat. Do you want to ask that question? Do you want me to frame it for you?
Yeah, I'll ask it. I'm part of the Green Runners community, and our badge is green and white, and the Green Runner thing's like a big, don't know, almost like a shamrock. And sometimes when I'm running at a distance, I get round about here, people that are Ranger supporters going like, "Is that a Celtic bag?" They hate the colour green. See, if you call something green, they totally hate it, to the extent that I've thought about changing the badge to blue. Is there any problem with calling anything green that you've came up against with green participatory budgeting, for example? Would you might be better changing it to environmental or community building participatory budgeting?
Yeah, I constantly trying to think of other ways of talking about participatory budgeting, because obviously the term participatory budgeting can be really off-putting. So I suppose there's a roundabout way of responding to you. My learning in Gava of the last 12, 13 years. So Gava would be a majority unionist Protestant village, but the outskirts are majority Catholic nationalists. So in a sense, the forest is a little bit of a interface zone. And that's been part of how the forest could become a place of community building, both between people and when the rest of the natural world or the species that live in the forest. It's only been in the last 2 years that I've actually started talking the language of climate change. Never used that before. Because again, it's quite politicized language and increasingly so. So absolutely, yeah, the language around all these things is so fragile, and thinking through that. I suppose the language we're using at the moment in Gava is, how do we look after the place that looks after us? And that really kind of brings in that interdependence between the health of the soil and the waters and the biodiversity and the land, because that is what allows us to thrive as people in that place. So I don't think I've necessarily answered your question, but I'm totally with you about the care of the language you use with different groups and different places.
I think my reflection on that, and I suppose within an English context or an inner city English context, is often that division between different ethnic minorities, and that sense of, can you get a space where both a white community and a multi-ethnic or a non-white community will meet, and how do you find that? And that's always a real big challenge to kind of reach across boundaries which already exist in communities or are perceived to exist. And that's why it's really important to put a lot of energy into that design at the early stage, bring people with different roles into that design process, and really kind of question where is the best place to host this, and how do we You know, make sure that when we talk about this process, it connects with people's lived experiences rather than us imposing our view upon them. So it's very much about that, trying to be careful and trying to be respectful and try to say what would it take to get even those people who, you know, a bit like a family, there's always tensions. What would it take to create a party that everybody would feel comfortable to be at? And that might be including creating safe spaces and just thinking all that thing through.
Just to quickly add to that, Joseph, is another thought that strikes me around this is defining community, which obviously is a challenge for all of us, about what are the boundaries of the PB. And the conversation in the design team around who is the community that's going to be involved in this PB process, particularly in the context of fault lines, whether they're political or community or cultural back, is really, really interesting. And in one small place, there was a whole discussion, should community be defined by the Church of Ireland parish lines? Or was it the Catholic Church parish lines? Or was it the 30-mile zone? Or was it townlands? So you had layers and layers of how people are defining community in that place. And that makes it a really interesting conversation.
There's lots of richness in this. And I suppose this is it. It's trying to unpick what is our traditional way of doing these sorts of democratic decision-making processes. We're getting on towards the end. I really appreciate, Karin, the time that you've given up. I know it's much harder because it's just you and me and then everyone else. Everybody got any other thoughts, perhaps about what they've picked up or learned from today and what has really resonated with them? Sophie.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, and thanks for sharing your experiences, Karin. It's been really interesting. I had, yeah, just kind of a question actually, just still carrying on from the discussion, but I guess also ties in with what you're asking as well, Jez, which is a question around like possibilities of scaling up, or whether that's kind of anathema to this idea of staying so community focused. I know I picked up on a point, observation you made at one point, Karin, when you said you felt you were still like in the foothills of PB, which was a nice line. And I was wondering if you could say just a bit more about that and whether that's to do with sort of the complexities of PB or whether that's to do with like, I don't know, the kind of political environment where we're in, where economic decisions are just so top down, right, and bureaucratic and actually dismissive of communities, and whether or if it's a combination of that. And I guess that's a question I'm sitting with in terms of PB is like, does it get scaled up, or in our political context, is that possible, or is that even a worthy thing to do, and is that trying to move too far away from building the kind of community aspects of it all? Anyway, any kind of reflections on that would be really interesting to hear.
Yeah, I think it's mainly because of the political and context of understanding who should be making decisions around about money. Before everyone came in, I was just saying to Jez that within our local council context, in terms of about 2 years ago, I swore I was never going back to another meeting to try and advocate for PB. It was just totally a waste of time. And just to focus on just to keep alive the flame of PB through citizen experience. But we've restored our energy, so we're going back for the fight again in terms of making the case to try at least to shift to generation 1.5, even not 2.0, and our asks are that the council use their own existing funds, but deliver through a PB process, which is linked to a council community planning priority, and that we shift to then the winning ideas the council and other statutory agencies deliver on. So that would be where we really want to go to, and our second ask has been a percentage of the rates. So that's been our two asks for a number of years to try and shift from 1.0, but it is a second one. It's a policy political context that just has not grabbed PB. Now, to be fair, there's been, and Claire might kind of speak to that, and in other council areas, there's been 2 or 3 other council areas that the council has really come behind PB and has shifted. So it might be the council area we're in as well. I think the plus side is that we have been able to grow citizen-led PB processes rather than statutory initiated PB.
Where?
Yeah, I would 100% agree with you, Karen. I'm experiencing the exact same thing currently in the council kind of area that I'm working in. There is a willingness to kind of grow it, but it's kind of fine tuning that and what that looks like. And I think sometimes there's a real fear still about the holding on to the purse strings and what growing that's going to mean for a particular council. So yeah, I'm very much in the same kind of situation, and I think Sophia's question is right on the money there. It's the it's the perfect question to ask about how do we navigate that, because I agree with you. I think it is largely political at the minute. It's trying to move it beyond that. Even when there's slightly, a bit of interest in doing so, it's working out the mechanics of how that's actually going to work. And like you said at the very beginning, the time that needs invested in it. I think, I suppose, from what I've seen so far, is that there's a wee bit of maybe a lack of understanding about the time that is required to grow it. So yeah, I would 100% agree. I don't really have the solution to it either. Um, I'm kind of stuck in that situation as well at the minute. But
I mean, if I can come in on that, obviously the Holy Grail is to say, how do we get PB into what we would call the mainstream, which is citizens directing council or public budgets. So it almost being a different chamber, a different governance system around how money is spent. It is hard, but we do have Scotland as a really great example. But what that shows is that political will and drive is really important behind this. And I think Northern Ireland is a really particular case because of that balance of powers between coming out of that long period of trouble. So I think there is more scope elsewhere to connect with a particular politician or a particular officer who is wanting to change the risk and move that dial. And that's what's happened in Scotland. So it is possible to do. But that advocacy with politicians, even if it's as simple as making sure that they get invited to the PB grant making decision day so they see it, I think is really important. And I mean, interestingly, just being aware of what's happening out there in the political space. So only today, I think Keir Starmer announced hundreds of millions of pounds or millions and millions of pounds for authorities in the north to improve places. Well, that sort of funding is really amenable to PB, to actually get communities to be deciding what is on one level funny money, regeneration money, one-off, but those sorts of opportunities to work with the council to make a bid for central government funding, to sort of draw in money from perhaps the private sector and connect it with council money, all those different imaginative ways, I think can and will move us forward if the political will is, and that's part of what this program is about, I hope, is that we'll have, after exploring this a bit, we'll come together and say, well, what messages work for different power holders to enable them to let go without sticking their claws in so hard that it leaves scars in the process. Any other thoughts or reflections? We've come up to over an hour. We've had quite a rich conversation. Anything else that people would like to say? Well, can I say, Karin, it's always a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to meet and work with you and see you. Thank you for carrying the banner of PB for so long. I know you've got a new job with Involve in Northern Ireland, so that's really significant. I'm thinking, great, let's leverage that power, because Involve is a well-respected organisation, and but mainly just thank you for coming along today.